Hello and welcome to Mobile Youth TV. My name is Graham Brown. Today we're looking at the Indian youth market, and to do this I'm joined by a very special guest who's going to help us dive into this market, not necessarily from the angle of product or technology, but really the angle of the question why. Why are young Indians buying certain products? Why are young Indians behaving in a certain way? So really we're going to get into their world and get down deep and really understand them from the psychological and social level. To do this, I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Freddie Benjamin. Freddie, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you, Graham.
Excellent. And with us today, we're privileged to have Kaustav Sengupta, who is the founder of InGene, which is a great blog. The details coming up here on the video. If you really want to know anything about young Indians, then this is the man who's really out there providing some thought leadership in terms of what's going right now. Kaustav, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Graham. How are you?
Fantastic. Good to have you here. You deal with these issues on a daily basis in terms of looking at young people, looking at the trends. You see their lives, right? And you see how things are changing and so on. We're really interested to know a couple of things. Firstly, what are the bigger picture trends with Indian youth today? Like, for example, your article about colours of Indian youth, right? You could take that article at face value and talk about trends, but I think there's a deeper trend there which you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So the first point is, what are the bigger trends? How Indian youth today are very different from their parents. They've got a very different economic, social background, right? Secondly, big companies in India, like the big mobile companies, do they get it? Are they still back in 1989 where it's all about Madonna and Pepsi and the big picture and so on?
I did a study and I found that you can categorize Indian youth. Normally what happens, the companies categorize them in the economical status and the backgrounds and all those things. But I think a socio-psychological category will be far better, because sometimes you find the economical zone, but the socio-psychology varies. So in that case, if you can categorize them, then you have three basic categories of youth in India. One who is very rooted to the tradition. I will call them as Bharatiyas. And another group which is in between, means they are 50% traditional and 50% towards global. I call them as Indians. And those almost 3%, they are more Inglodians. That means they're towards global views. They think they are global citizens instead of Indian citizens. So if you take those three categories, then majorly if you talk about how the trend is moving, it's more like it's kind of a ripple effect. And all those three categories tries to be differentiated from each other, tries to have their own ideologies and beliefs. So if you take this whole scenario, and if we take media as a way of communication, then we have basically India three very strong mediums. One of them is obviously TV, but TV is more towards the Bharatiyas, who is into traditional process. The other mediums, two mediums, if you talk about, then one is the internet and another one is mobile phone. Interestingly, if you take all these three medias, the major players of these medias thinks the youth category is somebody who can be taken as granted. So the basic problem what's happening in these medias are that they are actually trying to utilize youth. They are not trying to be with youth. So that's a major problem, what I can see overall. All the advertisements or the promotional activities are basically not thinking about them, but just to think about how to squeeze these people to get more money. And that's exactly how it's moving. So if you see these all basic medias among internet, which is very strong among all these three categories, and the next is mobile phone. So even if you take mobile phone, that category is also divided into basic categories. Like one is a category which I call as Nokia Chinese mobile phone, which is basically catering to Bharatiyas and Indians. One category I call them as Blackberry phones. If you see all these three categories, the Blackberry phone and the Black Cherry, which is basically a duplicate of Blackberry, which is there in Indian market, that's very popular among the Bharatiyas, but Indians and Inglodians are consciously going out of it to have a Blackberry. The usage of Blackberry is just not Blackberry. The basic use of Blackberry is Blackberry chat. That is the only thing which is very popular among them, because they think that's a space where nobody is there and they can have a thrill to be alone. Because, in India, the major problem what we have among youth is it's very tough to be alone. So to give a space which is very different, because Facebook is now crowded, you can't get a space which is alone. A very common thing among Facebook is called Facebook suicide, which is happening in India. That's very interesting criteria. Whereas Blackberry chat is giving you a space where even government can't access. So Blackberry phone is something which gives you a different category of friend list. So you have a friend list which we call as Facebook friend list. You have a friend list which we call as phone book friends list. friend list, and another one is Blackberry chat friend list. You can see the categorization of the friends in the media itself, and media doesn't know. So this is how the whole segment is moving. Basically, if you see this whole segment, then the interesting part is that their aspiration is not Blackberry. Their aspiration is actually iPhone. I have done an interesting study among all of them, and I told them to draw what is your aspiration, and almost 80% draw iPhone. So BlackBerry is something which is a basic necessity for them. So it's not an aspiration. If tomorrow iPhone comes in the same price range of BlackBerry, then you can imagine what will happen to BlackBerry.
Very, very interesting insights there. Let's go back a little bit and maybe we can drill down on some of these insights. I like your point about having your own space with BBM, BlackBerry Messenger. Let's put that into context. It's interesting because when text messaging took off around the world, one of the first things young people did was create their own language, text to speak. That was, back in the 90s in Japan when young girls were using pages. They would use numbers to represent words because they had limited scope. So it was almost like that barrier, this is our space against the adult world. And it's interesting you talk about young people in India not having space. The other markets we see BlackBerry Messenger really taking off, one being Indonesia. And again, in Indonesia, culturally is another society where space is communal, isn't it? There is no sort of individual space. Do you think there's a connection there? Are we reading too much into it?
There's definitely a connection in there. And the thrill what they gets out of it, very interestingly, they calls mobile phone as their personal diary. Why they calls it? Because that is one gadget which is not understood by the earlier generation. So this gives a thrill to them, and this thrill is common thrill what we used to get in our generation where we used to smoke in front of our parents and we got the thrill. The interesting thrill what they get out of it is they're sitting in front of their parents, like sitting in front of dad and sending BlackBerry messages to his girlfriend. That's a thrill which is coming out of this whole BlackBerry chat. Very interesting part out of this is that the language, what you were talking about, the creating our own lingo, globalization actually never made the languages common. So I can see in Chennai, the local languages are coming back very strongly in media among youth. So they're mixing English with their local Tamils and creating their own language, which is actually not English, neither Tamil.
Are they using this on texting and BBM, or is it?
Yes, they're using this on texting in BBM. They're using, very interestingly, they're using slangs, which is very local slangs. Earlier, if somebody uses a local slang, he or she used to be called as a person who belongs to a lower class. Right? So now the whole scenario got changed and they started using local slangs very confidently. So it's becoming more desi. The whole scenario is becoming more towards down to earth.
Freddie, being a reasonably young Indian up there in Delhi, how much of this do you see, in the big cities like Delhi?
Definitely it's there, like how Kaustav mentioned, Tamil and English mixing together to form a new sort of language. Here in North India, a lot of people speak Hindi, so Hindi and English, so like that's called Hinglish really. They have made movies that are actually in Hinglish now. And one of the things I actually wanted to, ask Kaustav, and I've followed your work, you said, how everything is becoming, desi, that is more and more traditional Indian, but sort of like a mix with the modern culture. One of the things that I've noticed in Mumbai and in Delhi is how the green fashion industry that's globally growing, how Indians have really started adopting, especially Indian youth. They adopt that green fashion culture and make it their own. It's not high-end brands, but they mix and match different things. You've written a lot of stuff about it. Could you give us some insights on that, how that evolved and what's happening on there?
Yeah, actually, Freddie, what's happening, the major criteria among youth is how they can differentiate themselves from the rest of the mass. It's a differentiation between a class and mass, and how the class can become more different than mass. For example, if you see eco-friendliness among youth, I will see it in a way that it's not actually eco-friendliness. It's more like showing off that you are eco-friendly. It's very, very interesting because most of them likes to wear eco-friendly clothing, but they doesn't bother about the space where they're staying. It doesn't show that they're mentally concentrating on eco-friendliness, but they're trying to show off that they're in favor of it. In Mumbai, very interestingly, I saw that there's a strong movement of underground brands which is coming out. And those brands which are actually unknown to rest of the country, those brands are becoming more famous. You must be knowing a brand called Happily Unmarried. They never gives an advertisement, but it sells. So it's more like how you can differentiate yourself from the rest of those masses. This is a kind of a codification or becoming a clustering. I can call it as a micro cluster. How you can cluster yourself from the rest of the people. For example, in Mumbai, I have gone to a store called Tapu Ki Dukan. You won't believe this store is on the first floor and you have to go to another store to reach to that store. But people goes there. That means they wants to be somebody who is not among the mass. So eco-friendliness is coming out in that way. So it's not that they are very eco-friendly, but they are showing off that they are eco-friendly.
I like your idea about micro-clustering. My question would be about the fact that new technologies, new media, access to media is sort of leveling the playing field between global brands and local brands. There seems to be two forces at play. One is economic in the sense that a local brand can compete now because it has distribution, both in terms of advertising media as well as the ability to find new customers and so on. But at the same time, there seems to be this other element. It seems to be okay now to support local culture, local brands, local language and so on. I'm just interested, in terms of young people in India today, you're talking about these sort of micro brands. I mean, how widespread is that people are into local brands? Do you have any stories of local brands which are sort of breaking out?
Yeah, I think Freddie must be knowing a very good example of a brand called PlayClan. PlayClan has hardly few stores. In Delhi might be 2 stores, in Mumbai might be 1 store. But interestingly, that brand has a good spread among those youth who thinks they are very different than the rest of the people. And it's not that it's a cheap brand. It's quite costly, but people buys it. It's more like the local brands are differently local. So it's more like they're having a global perspective of what a fashion is, but they present it in a local scenario. For example, if you take PlayClan's t-shirt, they have a photograph of Lord Shiva, but that Lord Shiva looks like a punk.
Right.
That's the exact mix of what Indian wants.
Okay, let's rewind the clock a little bit here. In the 90s, I was living out in Japan in the 90s, and at the time, in the mid-90s, there was a very interesting development in fashion where young Japanese high school girls were buying Burberry. At the time, Burberry was like a really traditional British brand. It's not the kind of thing that young girls wore, but they started buying Burberry scarves, Burberry skirts. 5 years later, Burberry started appearing hip-hop videos. The end of the 90s, like every hip-hop video coming out of America had Burberry. What happened was this very tiny micro-cluster, very sort of tight group of advocates were buying the brand and then spreading it out very slowly. That went into fashion magazines, and then hip-hop was at the edge of music, picked it up, and then that went mainstream, and then, it became so popular, it became unpopular, it died, right? In China, there's an interesting play on that. Chinese youth were buying Kappa, sportswear brand. It was popular in Europe in the 90s. But now Kappa's one of the biggest brands in China, because what happened was Chinese youth took the Kappa brand, like Shiva with the punk hair, they made it their own. They sort of took it and then twisted it.
Okay.
What's really interesting is that, Asia has this real potential as a launch pad for brands where people can take global brands which are relatively unknown, use the power of the numbers in these markets, so like India and China, the hunger for, new ideas and new brands and so on, and really twist those and then send them back into the world.
Thank you for watching Mobile Youth TV. We hope you enjoyed this episode covering insights on the Indian youth market. You can subscribe to our current newsletter at www.youthmobileage.com. Hope to see you next time.